a monetary mirage that visibly reveals the magic trick. Plebstock 2026. What is cooking? Past the full moon. Is your value pegged to your prized possessions, your cherished relationships, your status, or simply to your truth? How can you trust yourself to make the right decisions about your time on Earth? Current experiment, echoing July 1944 when 44 Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new monetary order that pegged their currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold. In my current limited and still studying understanding, I am watching two structures being built at the same time, and together they change what the dollar feels like in daily life. What is at stake here is reality, what we think is real and what we believe. So our reality is shaped by our belief system. If our beliefs about money, safety, and value are based on mirage, then the choices we make with our own savings and our time can take us very far from what we actually need. Let's dive in, shall we? On one side stands Tether. It calls itself a stable coin issuer, yet in practice it behaves like a private bank for people who cannot touch the United States banking system. It holds a gigantic portfolio of United States Treasury bills, plus physical gold and a large stash of Bitcoin. Its token, USDT, is the way hundreds of millions of people in emerging countries hold and move what they experience as dollars. These are not deposits at a regulated bank inside of the United States. These are claims on a company incorporated in the British Virgin Islands that now has a deep ties with El Salvador. Quote, Tether is not a cryptocurrency company. It is a private central bank that has dollarized the developing world without permission. Shanaka Anselm Pereira. The Genius Act has drawn a hard line. $1 system sits inside the United States where stable coins must be fully backed by cash and treasuries and supervised by Washington. An offshore dollar system keeps growing where Tether issues its own version of the dollars backed by treasuries, gold, and Bitcoin, supervised by no one in particular. For a huge part of the developing world, the issuer of everyday dollar is no longer the Federal Reserve. It is another private bank. For me, the mirage is simple. On the screen, everything still looks like neutral. Safe dollars. Underneath those balances are completely different IOUs tied to different balance sheets, different political risk at very different levels of control. The mirage is the shared belief that all of this belongs to $1 world. In practice, it is a layered structure that uses Bitcoin as collateral, Tether as a private dollar engine, and Genius compliant stablecoins as a public dollar engine, all plugged into the same mountain of government debt. Mirage. There is nothing stable in stablecoins. On the other side, the Federal Reserve itself is changing its relationship to the Treasury market in a way that I'm still learning to grasp. The headlines say that the quantitative tightening ended on the 1st of December and that the balance sheet froze around 6.57 trillion after draining more than 2 trillion from the financial system. Under the surface sits the plumbing. A repo is a secure overnight loan. One party hands over treasuries and receives cash, then reserves the trade the next day. A reverse repo is the same trade seen from the other side. The cash lender parks its money and holds treasury as collateral. Repurchase agreements have been part of the Federal Reserve toolkit for more than 1 century. In the United States, they show up around 1917 as a way for the Fed to lend to banks, and they grew into a core Wall Street funding tool in the second half of the 20th century, which is how they ended up at the heart of today's money markets plumbing scam. The overnight reverse repo facility was a place where money market funds and other large players could lend their spare cash to the Fed for one night and receive treasuries. At the peak, more than 2.5 trillion rested there. That was the cushion, a parking lot of unused liquidity. Now, that facility is almost empty. The spare cash has been pulled back into the system, and bank reserves sit near the level where small shocks can create big stress. At the same time, the standing repo facility has become the daily escape hatch in the opposite direction. Dealers arrive with treasuries and instantly turn them into reserves whenever they need dollars. When the secure overnight financing rates spiked in October, this window had to lend 18.5 billion in a single day. The backstop that was created for emergencies now looks like a permanent feature of the market. When I place these two pictures on top of each other, the mirage becomes clearer. The Fed has built an architecture where Treasury collateral can always be turned into central bank money on demand through the standing repo facility, while the old buffer of excess cash in the reverse repo facility has almost vanished. Tether has built a parallel architecture where the same Treasury collateral is transformed into offshore dollar tokens and shipped into a global south, backed also by gold and Bitcoin without democratic oversight. One structure is public, one is private. Both rest on the same foundation of United States government debt. If Tether fails, hundreds of billions of private dollar claims disappear for people far from Washington. If it thrives, it proves that the power to issue dollars and shape monetary reality can migrate into private hands. At the same time, the Fed has shifted into a role of lender of continuous resort in the Treasury market. The monetary system still presents itself as a neutral landscape of interest rates and safe sovereign debt. Underneath, the trick is already in motion and we stand inside the experiment. There is another layer that sharpens this picture. By forcing stablecoins issuers to hold only treasury bills, the Genius Act wires part of the demand for the United States debt directly into the stablecoin issuance. The Bank for International Settlements has already pointed to this link. It's literally the bank for central banks. It sits in Basel as a group chat and back office where more than 60 central banks keep reserves, compare notes, and quietly agree on how the game should be played. Its research shows that when dollar stablecoins grow, yields on treasuries fall a little. And when they shrink, yields jump much more. Every expansion of Tether and its peers quietly suppresses borrowing costs, and every contraction hits harder on the way out. The Genius Act, guiding and establishing national innovation for US stablecoins, hardwires this design into law. It tells every regulated payment stablecoin that its core job is to hold short-term treasuries and sit right next to the Fed and the Treasury market. In practice, it turns stablecoins issuers into narrow banks that live off sovereign debt. The same design that uses Tether as a silent buyer in good times turns into a source of instability when Bitcoin risks unwind, because every contraction in these balances pulls on the same collateral that holds the system together. If you want a simple translation of this acronym in my own language, Genius reads as, oh, we're being fooled again. Let us remember 2022 and Terra USD. Tried to hold $1 through mint and burn mechanics and collapsed to almost zero together with its sister token Luna once the peg broke. Earlier experiments like Basis, Cash, and Iron Finance also died in self-reinforcing spirals once confidence broke and redemptions accelerated. Most of the spectacular failures so far have been algorithmic designs that try to defend the peg with code and incentives instead of with boring reserves. Tether's USDT and the Genius-style payment stablecoins are reserve-backed. The risk looks different. It is less about an instant depeg caused by broken code and more about the quality and transparency of the assets of the balance sheet and the political and legal structure wrapped around them. I'm not a macro analyst. I am an artist and student of value, pulling threads from people who have been immersed in this plumbing for years and stitching them into my own language so I can understand where I'm standing and explain to you a little. Lynn Alden takes aim at the phrase, we owe the debt to ourselves, in one of her newsletters. She points out that the federal government owes money to very specific holders of treasuries with very different levels of power, not to a neutral collective self. Some are foreign governments, some are private institutions, some are individuals. The number and proportion matter. Defaults and devaluations land on real balance sheets, not on a mythical ourselves. Put it another way, if you have 1 million worth of treasuries in your retirement account and I have 100,000 worth of treasuries in my retirement account, yet both of us are taxpayers, then while in some sense we owe it to ourselves, it's certainly not in equal measure. Lynn Alden. All of this lands for me as a very simple question. When you open an app and see a dollar balance, what claim are you really holding? On which balance sheet and under whose law? Ta-da! Bitcoin. Structure of value always trying too hard to be free. I wrote earlier this year that Bitcoin will always be tied to government because its Genesis chart, Saturn lies in the second house in Virgo, where the structure of value is organized, and it opposes Uranus in the eighth house in Pisces, where the illusion of free shared values remain at risk. From an evolutionary astrology perspective, this picture makes sense to me. Saturn in the second in Virgo keeps Bitcoin's story tied to systems, accounting, and rules. Uranus in the eighth in Pisces keeps shaking the share pool of value and the dream of frictionless collective liquidity. With the progressed sun now in Aquarius in the sixth house, I see Bitcoin serving more as an infrastructure and service than as a clean escape. It is a bridge that carries value through the existing rails while those rails mutate. The ETFs, the way Tether holds Bitcoin and its reserves, and those arrangements show Bitcoin doing a job inside fiat's nervous system rather than standing fully outside of it. Pluto meeting that progressed sun in Aquarius exposes the shadow of this arrangement and asks a simple question that I also ask myself. How much of what we call monetary freedom still depends on the very fiat flows and institutions we claim to transcend? Many Bitcoiners still lean on the fiat lifestyle. In other words, they think and breathe dollars and high time preference and make economic decisions based on the moment, not realizing that saving in a hard asset can take many worries about the future away. Coming back from El Salvador, this split has become vivid in my own field. I see two clear camps forming around Bitcoin. One camp is the grassroots builders in places like El Salvador who are creating circular economies, teaching people, running small businesses, and using Bitcoin both as a store of value and a medium of exchange. It changes how they relate to time, work, and community. The other camp is the institutional world that treats Bitcoin as a hedge inside portfolios and as a piece of collateral in the same old games. Both camps use the same protocol. The intention and the lived reality are completely different. Let us take the crystal ball out for a moment. Having felt a profound inner shift over the last weekend and stepping into December 1st, I feel as if I have already entered 2026. Saturn and Mercury turning direct give a clear kick forward while Neptune prepares to station direct next week. With that tone in my body, I decided to look ahead into 2026 and 2027 to see how the next movements in the sky lean on Bitcoin's own chart. So much is shifting over the next year that I wanted a first pass, a way to sense what might be in store rather than arrive at those dates empty-handed. I treat this as a pattern work, not as a fixed script. The chart gives me questions, images, and tensions to track as the macro plumbing keeps changing under our feet. On the 20th of February 2026, Saturn and Neptune meet, and in Bitcoin's natal chart, that conjunction happens very close to its moon in the ninth house. For me, this looks like a turning point in the way collective belief and collective fear project onto Bitcoin. There is a closing of one way of thinking and a slow birth of another. The nodes and Pluto move through Aquarius in the sixth house and ask a simple thing. Is Bitcoin only a story about escape, or is it already embedded as daily infrastructure and service? Around the same period, the North Node joins Venus and the Sun in the eighth house, and I see a deepening question around shared value, collateral, and who actually benefits from this protocol while institutions keep wrapping it inside their own games. Mars, Vesta, and Neptune gather in the seventh house and heat up the field of counterparties and alliances. That mix can look like devotion to a cause or like spiritual language covering legal traps. And again, the chart refuses to decide for us. It simply holds up the mirror. When I extend the chart further to October 2027, the picture becomes even more suggestive. The progressed moon in Sagittarius enters a balsamic phase with Black Moon Lilith in the fifth house, which to me reads like the end of the childish speculative cycle and the preparation for a more conscious creative phase. The progressed North Node in Aquarius in the sixth house, together with Pluto transit there, keeps pushing Bitcoin into a role of service and work, less glamour and more quiet responsibility. Neptune sits exactly on Bitcoin's natal moon, and Chiron moves into Taurus in the ninth house next to Vesta. So the philosophy around value carries both more devotion and more pain. Some people will use this rail to rebuild parts of civilization. Others will keep treating it as a one more hedge inside a fiat portfolio. The sky simply mirrors that split and invites us to decide where our trust and value actually live. Full moon in Gemini and the skip step. This week we also stand under the full moon in Gemini on the 4th of December. The sun is in Sagittarius, Venus walks just behind it in a balsamic relationship, and Black Moon Lilith travels through Sagittarius close to Venus. Mars at 22 degrees of Sagittarius squares Saturn in Pisces. The full moon itself squares the nodal axis at 12 degrees. In evolutionary astrology, that kind of a square is called a skip step. Something in our habitual way of moving between past and future needs to be faced and integrated, not avoided. Back in June this year, the full moon in Sagittarius also squared the nodes. Mars was in Leo squaring Uranus. Jupiter had just entered Cancer and was conjunct Mercury. Pluto retrograde squared Venus in Taurus and Vesta in Scorpio. I wrote then about the way the body remembers for us, about kidney stones and the way meaning lands when the body refuses to keep carrying misalignment. The piece was titled, What is Misaligned Has No Anchor. Jupiter enters Cancer. Can you feel the meaning yet? I will link it here for anyone who wants to revisit that moment. Try to think what you were doing around June 11th, 2025. The themes are the same, but they're landing at the opposite side. What lands in the body becomes real. Victimhood is a decision to live without courage. This December full moon in Gemini brings those threads back. The mind can spin into stories and volatility. Gemini loves options and jokes. The square to the nose and to the Sagittarius sun asks for grounding between discernment and surrender. Black Moon Lilith with Venus in Sagittarius wants to stop lying to herself. Mars with Juno in Sagittarius squares Saturn in Pisces. The compromise with truth matters. Ideals and spiritual language need to become applicable. No more philosophy that never touches daily life. For me, the question is practical. Before February 2026, what scripts about money, health, work, and love am I still carrying from the old world? Which of those scripts am I willing to release so that my body, my schedule, and my savings actually reflect what I value? Reality, belief, and the matrix feeling. All year, I've been saying that the last degrees of Saturn and Neptune in Pisces before their conjunction on February 2026 are pivotal to understand where you are standing and what your reality is. Reality, in this sense, is the relationship between your beliefs and your actions. What you think is real is what you allow yourself to act upon. Since 2020, we have lived through scenes that many of us never thought possible. Lockdowns against our own property rights, yes, our bodies. The ongoing retarded pressure to inject substances into our bodies in order to participate in basic life. What the fuck was that? Narratives about health and safety that did not match what many of us observed around us. For me, those years ripped the roof off the house. Everything that came after made more sense once I accepted the reality. I have no interest in fear. What I care about is responsibility. Over these last months, I keep asking very simple questions. How do I relate to my body? Who do I believe is in charge of my body? Is it the government and the pharmaceutical industry? Is it some expert? Of course not. It is me. How do you care for your needs? How much blame do you still project onto institutions for choices that in the end belong to you? Recently, I tried to have a dialogue with a young artist in England on Instagram. He spoke about the tragedy of being an artist now, how artists are born limited, victimized, and oppressed, how the system makes it impossible to be free. The tone was familiar. It echoed Marxism and all the ideological scripts that train people to feel defeated before they begin. I told him, despite being so young, he was already preaching that the only answer is to be a victim. And I said, study money. He said, no human should study money. He's angry against capitalists, but ignores that the socialism agenda needs money. He made fun of me, which is fine. At one point, he said that my line about once living inside the rat race and escaping proof that I am also a victim. Ha ha ha. I answered that seeing the Matrix is precisely what ended the victim story for me. Awareness brings choice. We live in a huge matrix. I do not trust fiat money. I do not trust governments. I don't trust food systems or narratives by default. Every day I make sure that I align with the light that is within. My mother once came in a dream after she passed and she said to me, if you want to be close to me, be the light. Emanate the power and the wisdom of God. We all carry that creative power, by the way. Over the next weeks, I expect more revelations, more surprises, and more alignments. It is up to each one of us to decide what to do with that information. You can join the FUD and align with fear. You can keep scrolling and hope for the best, or you can just put your feet on the ground, touch grass, feel your own body, and start making plans from the inside out. I'm already envisioning in that state of mind. Everything you see, everything you feel, everything you think, and everything you are rests on how you relate to it. Reasoning. At a personal level, I have given my body and my life time to discern this year so I can surrender to my truth. I can now say that I trust my sense of value, my sense of price, and any material definition that flows from that. The practice virtue of 2025 has been discernment, and I have lived it through with joy. The virtue of the coming year will be courage, and we will need it. So I close with this question for you. When you look at your own balances and habits, where does your money actually sit? Which architecture are you strengthening with every so-called dollar you hold? And which beliefs about reality are you ready to retire before Saturn and Neptune write the next chapter? Attributioning sources. Most of the hard plumbing in this node comes from Shanaka Alcen Pereira's work on Tether, the Genius Act, and what calls the standing repo era, from Preston Pish and Matt Pines on the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the way the standing repo facility changes the treasury market, and from Lynn Alden's research on the overnight reverse repo facility, debt holders, and selective default. In their conversation on the Genius Act and the strategic Bitcoin reserve, Matt Pines describes a strong strategic synergy between stablecoins in the United States, but also between Bitcoin and stablecoins in the United States interests. There's a link to the Shanaka Alcen Pereira Substack. There's a link to that conversation between Preston and Matt Pines. There's a link to Lynn Alden's article on public debt and selective default. And then last but not least, I also have a link, Bretton Woods 2.0, Building the Bitcoin Monetary Order, a panel from Bitcoin 2025 Vegas with Efrat Fenixon, Ben Shamoa, Roger Huang, and Cedric Youngerman. Have a great week. Happy Football!